Well, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Unlock Show. I'm your host, Tracy Wilson, and you guys are in for an absolute treat today. I have got my very special guest, Anwar Jumabhoy, all the way from Malaysia. So he's got up, we were just talking about this a little bit earlier, what time of the day it is. It doesn't really matter in this global world that we live in, where we have, business people from all over the globe that are able to jump on podcasts, live shows, even work together in different, corners of the world. So Anwar is a keynote speaker, a facilitator, a coach, and the co-author of the 9 Entrepreneurisms. Gosh, I got to get that word out right. Entrepreneurisms, management practice for a VUCA world. Now, you guys are probably wondering, what the heck is a VUCA world? Well, don't worry, because we're going to fill you in on what that little acronym means very, very shortly. He has a vast and broad experience that actually helps him to coach and mentor entrepreneurs, corporate executives, companies, and teams across a really diverse set of industry sectors. And he helps them to actually tap in to the power of entrepreneurship. He's been helping people and companies create new strategies, new business models, and he draws on his real passion, which is to help them create the entrepreneurial mindset. So Anwar believes that entrepreneurs are often misunderstood, and I would have to agree with that, as risk takers who are, trying to get out there and start something on their own, but it can be, in air quotes, risky business. So we're going to talk about and debunk some of those myths about risk taking as an entrepreneur and as a business owner. So keep tuning in and listen to what Anwar's got to say today, because I know that he's going to give you some real insights into what's actually happening in the global market of business today. So welcome to the show, Anwar. Fantastic to have you here.
Great, Tracy. Thank you so much for having me. Always great to share ideas and meet interesting people and inspiring people like yourself.
You're very welcome. Well, look, let's sort of start for our viewers and give them all a little bit of background on you, and what's brought you to be doing what you're doing today.
Well, like most people, you sort of go off and study something. You're not entirely sure why you were studying it. So I went off to university and I read or studied naval architecture, which is really learning how to build ships and rigs. And I worked as a naval architect for a number of years before I sort of realized that this really wasn't something that I wanted to do. And then, so the second phase of my sort of career, I did an MBA, and then I worked for a number of businesses, small businesses, and in fact, try to start my own business, and that didn't work out twice. So I lost money, lost some family money, lost some money from professional investors, and then I had to go back to work. And so when I look back and I think about what's the common thread in all the experiences that I had, and I realized that really the common thread was I wanted to do things that made sense. And I wanted to do things that came naturally. And the things that make sense and the things that come naturally are really entrepreneurial, because, we're all born entrepreneurial. It's just that when we join an organization, or we join many organizations, they say, welcome aboard, Tracy, park your entrepreneurship outside, use it for your own stuff, making decisions, getting married, buying investments, but don't bring it into the moment you walk into our office, you got to follow the rules and procedures. And that never sat comfortably with me, because some of those things don't make sense. So really, I sort of came to the realization, and that's the reason for the book. I came to the realization that we are all entrepreneurial, right? It's just that some organizations allow us to do that and some don't. And the ones that don't are the ones that are so wedded to process and procedure that they've lost sight. They've just lost sight of why they exist. And people in those organizations are hanging on to their position, hanging on to their procedure. And many of them have forgotten, how can you be customer centric if you're only interested in process?
It's a funny thing, isn't it? Because like you, I worked in a corporate organisation for 20 odd years, and I even remember, being in senior management there. The words that you would use: "Leave your baggage at the door." That's the way things are done around here. That became sort of common narrative or conversation that you would have with people. So even when they came and said, "Hey, I've got a really great idea," I mean, in most cases, if you're a good manager, you can somehow, weave in that great idea because, like you say, you're using your logic and you're using good sense to determine, hey, is this actually a really good idea? And just because we do things, it's been done that way around here for the last 10 years, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way. So I can totally, relate to that because I've been in that situation, too. And isn't it interesting that it doesn't matter where you are in the world? I'm here in Australia. I've worked in Australia and in New Zealand. You're in Malaysia. I know you've worked around the world too, but that seems to be a common, I'm going to say, global thread that is embedded in a lot of organizations. So when you think about that and with your, background and going, this just doesn't sit very right with me. And then kind of having a bit of a play with a few things yourself, starting your own businesses. And like you said, we live and we learn, right? We make mistakes and we learn, well, that probably wasn't the greatest idea to go down that path. I won't do that again. But, I want to ask the question, because this is something I think a lot of entrepreneurs or people who have that, you say, we're born with these entrepreneurial skills, but not everybody takes those skills and applies them in an entrepreneurial way. So what was it what advice would you give to somebody that is thinking about doing something entrepreneurial, but maybe hasn't quite taken the leap yet?
Okay, so Tracy, the way that you've described it is something that that we're trying to address. So you can be entrepreneurial in two ways, right? So you can be entrepreneurial in that you go off and start a business, and anybody who wants to start a business needs to have a skill set that the business requires, right? And you can see in the pandemic the mushrooming of home food businesses, cakes, barbecues, home meals, etc. So these are skills that people have. They've been using it as a passion, as a hobby, and now realize that this is something that they want to do, and this is something they are good at. And as they go through that iterative process, they get better and better, and then they say, okay, let's start a business. And to start a business, you do need to have that skill set, and that's one of the things that we talk about in the book, which is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is really understanding what you are good at and what you know how to do. You can do it as an individual and you can do it as an organization. But the other part of being entrepreneurial is really in an organization. We tell people, ask yourself, does this process make sense? Does this process have to be applied every single time? Why can't we make an exception? And Tracy, as you worked in organizations, you realize that these processes just get piled on one after the other, right? So something happens and the whole organization gets together and they say, we don't want this to happen again. So let's have an SOP, let's have a procedure. And then it happened once, right? And you have all these processes. Then something else happens, and then you build another process. And soon you're building processes to prevent things from happening, which makes sense. But how often do they happen? And really, what's the terrible impact of them happening? And maybe the impact of them happening will lead you to an insight which will give you more revenue. So you if you work in an organization, you need to start to ask yourself, is this benefiting the customer? Because anything that doesn't benefit the customer, it doesn't benefit the customer, ultimately is going to hurt you, right?
It's going to be detrimental to business.
Exactly, in the long term, right? And one of the silly examples that I give, excuse examples that I give is look at what's happening in the food industry. Like, for example, um, let's look at biscuits or soups, right? You have large companies making these things, and because they're trying to get longevity of on shelf life, because they're trying to bring the cost down, they start to substitute, you know, organic, real materials with chemical, with enhanced materials, so that
Mm-hmm.
stuff can sit in the fridge forever or sit on the shelf forever, and the costs come down, right? So we went through a period of the 70s and 80s, maybe even into the 90s, where processed food and preserved food was the king because it was low cost, and these
Mm.
large organizations were successful in making it, right? And then people sort of woke up in the 2000s and said, we don't want to eat this, you know wrap. And so you have small companies that started coming up with new products which were much more expensive than the ones that the large companies were making, but they
Mm.
sold, and they sold well. And these were all people who are little entrepreneurial businesses who started doing organic stuff, who started doing small batches, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the difference, right? So you're on a train to make things cheaper and long lasting, and somebody in your organizations comes to you and says, Tracy, we really need, the world's changing, we need to do something different. And your boss says, my bonus is dependent on profits, and if we start to
Mm-hmm.
do something different, things may go wrong, we might have a bad year. I don't want to be in the seat for that. And so
Mm.
the whole organization then keeps its course until, many of them have unhappy endings. I mean, Toys R Us refused to go online, right?
Yeah. Blockbuster, I mean, BlackBerry, there's a whole bunch of companies that we could rattle off that
Yep.
have fallen victim to not not having their ear to the ground, not really keeping up to date with what their market wants. And
Actually,
what's
Tracy, I would have a different view. Many people in those organizations, in our book, we interviewed somebody from
mm,
Ericsson, and Ericsson knew that Apple was coming up with the product. They knew that it was
mm,
touch screen, and they asked their customers, "Would you like touch screen?" And the customer says, "No, we're quite happy with this, key
mm,
and keyboard stuff." That was the wrong question, right? But there were
correct.
people there were people in the organizations who were aware, and
Hmm.
we look back and we can see that it's crystal clear, but at the time it wasn't. And so leadership is a challenge, and for leaders, because we talk about VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous.
Hmm.
Lots of stuff is happening all the time. It's like
Hmm.
standing at the ocean and wondering, where each little bob that's floating is going to go. It's not
Hmm.
easy, but the job of leaders is to be able to sift through these things and commit resources.
Mm. Well, you make a really good point with that because I think, often the natural thing is, all right, let's go, and BlackBerry or Ericsson is a good example. Let's go out and ask their audience, the consumer, what is it that they want? And sometimes, like you say, you've got to be able to ask the right question. And secondly, you want to ask the right consumers, because if you're asking people that don't really know the industry, are not up to date with what is actually coming from a technological point of view, then of course they're going to say no, everything what I've got right now is just fine. I'm quite happy with my my igloo ice box. I don't really need a fridge. But
Correct.
once you actually bring it to the market and they see, hey, there's some real benefit in this, I'm able to use this, it's making my life better, faster, whatever the case may be, then the market obviously adapts and starts to change with that. Which leads me to the next question, which is around how do you, because the market is constantly changing, and we're as entrepreneurs or as business owners, we need to, one of your non-entrepreneurisms is innovation, and just making sure that we're staying at the top of the game and we're innovating where it makes sense to innovate.
Yep.
Um, how do you identify when your market or a market you are going to enter or a market that you're in is changing, that there is some disruption happening in that market? How do you identify it? And then how do you, like, what are some of the questions you need to be asking yourself to determine whether or not you need to do something about that?
Okay, so there's a couple of things, Tracy, you talk about. One is that most most of the world and most people are split between two simple choices, right? We have
Mm,
right and wrong, we have left and right. It's always two. So in terms of the consumer and the employee, and all of us, we are either chasing pleasure or avoiding pain, right? So it's the
mm,
pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. It's the same for
mm,
everybody, and that's why people have been people since the first person was created, and
mm,
selling remains the same because selling remains about, do you push people towards pleasure or do you get people to avoid pain, right? So it's always two: left, right, wrong, pain, pleasure. And it happens at many times in the day. So it's sometimes you might do something because you want to avoid pain, right? So you may not want to eat the second cookie because you're worried about the weight. And sometimes you want to go for pleasure, so you might eat the second cookie because you want that pleasure, right? So even in the day we have pain and pleasure, playing out. It's the same. So in an organization and when you're dealing with customers, you have these two things that are happening always, that are the drivers, and you have to look at how you produce things and what you produce, right?
mm,
So again, is there a better way of doing it? Is there a cheaper way of doing it? Is there a faster way of doing it? What you produce, right? Are there different things you can produce? And then you have to look at the customer, right? How is the customer evolving? What are his expectations, and where are they going towards, right? So we talked earlier about time, right? So time has become
mm,
relative. 15, 18 years ago, 20 years ago, we would talk about tenure or use of product in years. Today we talk
mhm,
about tenure and use of product in months, and it,
mhm,
it might be weeks, right? So you have to constantly experiment with your products, experiment with your customers. And the young entrepreneurs, that's what they're doing. And this is one of the things that we talk about in the book. One of the entrepreneurisms is risk taking. Not everything
mm,
is going to work out, but you
mhm.
have to constantly experiment. If you don't experiment, because nobody knows the future, right? And I think Peter Thiel, obviously very famous investor, and I think and founder of a co-founder of PayPal, he said it doesn't really matter when this change is going to happen. What you need to be conscious about is your forecast getting longer? In other words, the change is less likely, or is your forecast getting shorter? So when we talk
Mhm,
about autonomous cars, 30 years ago we said, oh, it won't happen for 100 years, and then we
mhm,
said it won't happen for 50 years, then we said it won't happen for 10 years. It's getting shorter and shorter, right? And so
mm,
then you should be betting some money on that. Electric vehicles, I mean, Tesla came out of nowhere.
mhm.
The technology was there. It's not that he invented the technology. And you can see now today, the moment that they've established a trend, the number of EV companies is just mushrooming,
Yeah.
right? Because in fact, the EV car is so much simpler. Less
Mm,
parts, less things can go wrong. More people can make it. And there's another example, and I digress a bit, but Dyson, who's very famous for their
mhm.
for their for
Well,
their
they've
blow.
started out with the vacuum cleaner, and now it's the hair wand. Mhm.
Yes, and
Yeah.
apparently it's a wonderful product. But at one point, he set up a establishment in Singapore to make electric vehicles, and because he has mastered the art of making motors, and he looked at the profitability of an EV based on what the Tesla was selling. And I don't know him, but he must have thought to himself, hey, if there's that much profit in each car, it makes a good business. And
Mhm.
then with every month that passed and the price of the EV came down, he began to realize that I don't think there's enough profit in this business. And he shut down the whole, that whole
Operation.
business of
Yeah.
his, operation of his, making electric vehicles, because he came to the realization that margins are going to keep falling and he doesn't want to do a business below X. And it already hit X. And so he laid off 2,000 people, shut the business down.
And I think what you can learn from that story in itself is that, he had a plan and he knew his numbers. He knew what, to be able to produce what I want to produce, I've got to do it at this level. These are the margins I want. This is what the environment
Yep.
that I need to create to make this venture, profitable and doable. And if I can't meet those, then it's time for me to say, I'm exiting out of that. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from that, because often, as entrepreneurs, we don't often go down that path. We don't think about those things at the beginning, right? Like you were saying, in a market where things are changing, often people will say, hey, well, I'm a really good baker. I can bake lovely cakes at home. I'll bake some cupcakes and sell those. And we sort of just go into things with, I've got a skill, I've got a passion,
Why not?
and not, yeah, yeah. But at the same token, like using all of that, but then also applying and overlaying, like you talk about in the book, is overlaying that business sense and that business acumen to
Yes.
ensure that you're not just profitable or doing something that's fun in this moment. You want to make it profitable and sustainable long term. And what does that actually look like?
Yeah. So I mean, if entrepreneurship was always financially rewarding, there'd be you wouldn't get the number of business failures that you get, right?
Yeah.
And so what I say to people is that don't set these unrealistic expectations on yourself, right? If you want to start a business and you have the skill set and you see there's a market and you can get an iteration for your product, then great, go for it. But if you don't want to take that risk, then work in an organization. That's also okay. But don't work in an organization and do silly things, right? And things that don't, it's like in the old days of, soldiers digging trenches and filling them up. I mean, how long will you keep soldiers motivated by training them how to dig a trench and then fill it up, right? And organizations, a lot of organizations do that with their people. What the
Yeah.
pandemic has done and what work from home has done, and we talked about this earlier, Tracy, before we came on air. What the pandemic has done is that it's made people understand and try and adjust to the fact that they are no longer being paid for the hours that they clock in. That's huge, right?
Massive. And I think, like you're saying, well, as we were talking before we jumped on and went live, was that that the pandemic really has provided a disruption to the world that we knew. Things changed, people started to adapt, but they started with that thought of, hang on a minute, does the organization, like we were talking about, does the organization actually need this role that I've been paying somebody for? And then on the flip side of that, the employees going, is this actually what I want to do now? It gave a whole lot of people
Yep.
a taste of working from home, which they had never ever even contemplated doing in the past. It was just like that was a no-go zone. You didn't get the opportunity to work from home. The option was you come into the office and you work here. So we can keep an eye on you. We can make sure
That's
that
right.
you're clocking in, you're clocking out, and we're paying you for those hours. Whereas now, with with the opportunity for people to work home, like you're saying, it's switched. We've moved from pay by the hour to, I'm going to say, pay for performance or pay for outcome.
Pay for outcome. Yeah. And Tracy, that pay for outcome has always been with us. It's just that, we talked about left and right and right and wrong. We talked about that's a duality, right? So when you go and
Yeah.
get your nails done, you pay for when you get your nails done. And I'm betting that the person who does your nails also gets paid every time he or she does a set of nails, right? Now, you don't worry about what she's going to do when she's not doing your nails, or you get a haircut, right? Or you get your garden mowed. So this pay for work output has been there. It's just that nobody could figure out how to do it for office type jobs.
Mm.
And now people are figuring that out, right? So if you're processing invoices, so rather than I pay you for the hour and worry about how many invoices you're processing, or if you're answering calls, and rather than I worry about how many calls you're answering, maybe I'll devise a system that says I'll pay you X per invoice processed, or I'll pay you X per call answered, or I'll pay you.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly both people have flexibility and freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to get paid more, you process more. I don't have to worry about your productivity because,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I don't have to pretend that I can control your productivity by watching you. I can't.
Mm-hmm. And isn't that interesting that the task itself hasn't actually changed? It's
Right.
just the way in which we look at it. Like you're talking about the entrepreneurial mindset. And so, therefore, the way we look at things is a little bit different. And therefore, the way in which we measure things is a little bit different. And if you've got two parties that are on board, or, with the same, okay, I get that. I understand what I've got to do. And you allow the person to do that, then it's a win-win for all parties involved.
Yeah, and I used to work for a long time in a budget hotel business, and so we
Mm,
we were a budget hotel, a part of the AirAsia group called Tune Hotel, and so we had hotels, or we had hotels in the Asian region, and we also had in the UK, and we had in Melbourne. So I was responsible for the hotel in Melbourne, and every city we go to, we hire local,
mm-hmm,
we find local contractors and suppliers. And so when we went to Melbourne, we found somebody who would pick up our sheets and wash them for us. We found
mm,
somebody who would supply us labor, and we would pay per room cleaned. Australia, interestingly enough, has very, very strong labor laws, and very protective
mm.
of holidays, right? So it's the first time I came across that if you clean a room after midnight, it costs
This-
more. If you clean a room on a Saturday, it costs more than a
mhm.
weekday. And if you clean a room on a public holiday, it costs a hell of a lot more.
Uh-huh.
we don't have that in
Absolutely.
we don't have that in Asia, and we don't have that in the UK. It's the same rate, however, whenever we clean it. And so the people who are cleaning the rooms also get paid on a per clean basis, right? So
Mm,
it's a sort of, and it helps us measure our costs. Helps us manage our costs, and it gives. I mean, you can argue two ways. Yeah, is it unfair for the person doing the job? Would they rather get paid for 8 hours and have no incentive to work better or harder or faster,
mm,
and be tied to the 8 hours, right? So maybe they
mm-hmm.
just want to work 2 hours. And these are questions that leadership and management faces, that there are no easy answers, because there's a plus on both
Yeah.
and there's a minus on both, right? The
Mm-hmm.
reason why we removed this work for output was in the industrial revolution, when steam engines were created, and the UK started what was called sweatshops. And you
Mm-hmm.
had this labor migration from, people used to own two pieces of clothing before mass production, right? People used to, in the UK,
Mm,
own two pieces of clothing, because they whatever they made and whatever they wore, they made themselves. And all this employment in the farms and in agriculture, when the steam engine came up and mechanization came up, all these people were suddenly unemployed, and they moved into the city, and then they started to get jobs in these places, and they were then producing clothes, and they were producing other products. And suddenly,
mm.
this there was this whole new retail business, and people had then multiple sets of clothes, but the workers were very badly treated,
Yeah.
or many of the workers were very badly treated, right? And so there's been a stigma on output based compensation, and the
Mm,
whole labor laws have come up to protect output based compensation.
mm-hmm.
Then you had a company like Uber that came about and said, hey, and lots of people said, I want to be output based.
Yeah.
I remember when we had our hotel under construction in Melbourne, and I was there. I got into an Uber, and the guy he said, it's my second day. I never heard of this. And I said, how did you end up doing it? And he said, my son said, why don't you do this? And so I
Yeah.
applied, and I'm an Uber driver, right?
And here I
So
go.
yeah, we are, this is the issue of morality that is, entrepreneurs. What we say is entrepreneurs are amoral. They don't look at the moral issue. They
Mm-hmm.
just do what they think is right, and yes, sometimes people might get hurt,
Mm-hmm.
but that happens, and it's so entrepreneurs just get things done, and organizations need to have more of that attitude. We just want to get it done, and otherwise they get beaten out by. I mean, look at the case of Zoom, right? Which has become,
Mm-hmm.
you know, everybody has Zoom today. I mean, the guy who started Zoom worked. I mean, he worked for Zoom. It was acquired by Cisco, and they built this wonderful bells and whistles product that I don't know what they call it, a teleport or something they called it, and they get a was very expensive product with all the bells and whistles, all the security features, because Cisco said, our customers
Mm-hmm.
want all this kind of stuff. He must have gone to his boss many times and said, "Can we have a simple product that we can sell to
Mm.
everybody?" And his boss must have said, "No, it doesn't fit with what our customers want." And so he left Cisco with a bunch of his engineers and formed Zoom.
And now look.
Look, so
Yes.
so I, so I tell employees that be careful of who you say no to, because
Yeah.
this guy
Yeah.
might just turn around, go out and start a business and compete with you.
Mm-hmm. Be your competition, absolutely. Look, before we, I mean, one of the things we want to get through today too is just understand it, because I know you've written the book, the 9 Entrepreneurisms. So let's talk a little bit about the book and
Okay.
what are the 9 Entrepreneurisms that,
Okay.
and how do we learn those? Of course, we buy the book, right?
Well,
That was an easy
you
question. Easy question
that
to answer.
well, you learn them by what, and so the book came about through our own experiences. Three, my
Mm-hmm.
co-author and myself. It came about through about 100 interviews that we did with academicians, corporate leaders, and entrepreneurs, and it came about from distilling all the data that we'd collected, and we came up with 9 what we call entrepreneurisms, which is a tough word. And what we're trying to tell people is that entrepreneurs are not different people, they just
Mm-hmm.
do things differently. And
Mm.
we try to define this do things differently as an entrepreneurism. So it's
Mm.
something that you can learn. We talked earlier about self-efficacy, which is, at the core. You have to know what you're good at, both as an individual and as an organization, right? You have to know
Yeah.
that's something that's critical, and you have to keep building it, right? And if you get ahead and you build it, you can stay ahead, right? Um, and we talked about risk taking, right? Which is you need
Mm-hmm.
to experiment, and you need to expect some things will go wrong. You know, I I have a grandchild, and when she falls down, the parents don't say, "Little girl, please don't try and walk because you might fall."
Mm.
I mean, it's a journey, right? She's gonna
Yeah.
fall. Right? You don't tell people, "Oh, you're not skilled enough to walk. Let's just work on the skill. Don't walk. Let's work on
Mm-hmm.
the skill till we're sure you can walk, and then you
Yeah.
can walk."
Yeah.
I mean, people
But
don't do that,
no.
right? So
But isn't that interesting? Like you're saying, we're born this way, and all the things we do as a child is you just get up and you just do it, right? Like you say,
exactly,
you just get up and you just walk, and over time, you might be a little bit wobbly to begin with. You might fall down a few times, but you don't say, "Hey, I'm not going to let you walk," because you might fall over. But that's funnily enough how we tend to apply that logic to business. Oh no, I better not do that because that's a bit too risky, or this one
yes,
that might happen. Interesting mindset, isn't it? We're
and
somewhere
because
along the line we get
yeah,
that yeah, the entrepreneurial spirit gets
pushed out of.
yeah, melted away.
Yeah, and because we
Mm,
tend to focus on history, right? So we
mm,
we see a profit and loss account, and we can see what happened in the past, but very few people ask the question, what have we missed out on? Yes, I know we could have
yeah.
saved the money, but what did we miss out on? And accountants, HR people, they tend to look at the past and they say, oh, we could have saved this and we could have saved that. they don't ask the question, what are the possibilities we haven't pursued?
Mm,
What are the opportunities that we haven't pursued? We're so
mm,
focused on trying to see after the fact, oh, let's look back and see what we can save. We don't say, let's look forward and see what we can gain, right?
yeah.
So, and that's what young entrepreneurs are doing. They're saying, hey, yeah, I know it made a mistake, but look at what we've gained.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the knowledge we've gained. Look at the
Mm-hmm.
opportunity that we've uncovered, because that's not in the profit and loss account. So I'm digressing, but if the
No,
nine
but
on,
yeah, I mean, that's all those things that you're just talking about is part of that nine entrepreneurisms, right?
yes,
It's like opportunism.
yes,
When I'm looking forward, what opportunities actually exist, and
yes,
then taking into account, what have I actually learned along this journey? Because
that's
I
right.
mean, most people like you would have said, all right, well, I left my job, I started my own business, I've used some family money, I got some investors, and oh my God, it didn't go to plan. I'm not going to go there again. But no,
Yep,
you didn't do that. You were like, okay, well, what can I learn from this? What
exactly,
opportunity exists? What do I need to do a little bit differently? And off you go again, just like your
exactly.
granddaughter walking. Get up,
and
off you go.
and and that's something that's important for young people to do, because I
Mm,
mean, Steve Jobs, said it many years ago when he did these classes in calligraphy, and he said that's what was inspired him to produce new scripts, right?
mm-hmm,
So there are little gems of experience, and there are little nuggets of both experience and skill that we had
mm,
in the past, and that's why it's very important for young people to experiment, try things, because you
yeah.
don't know whether in 5 years or 10 years that little nugget that you had can be built on,
Mm-hmm.
and that's critically important.
And I think that is a really important message to get out to particularly young, budding entrepreneurs, because for the past 30, 50 odd years and longer, we've been brought up in a world where, okay, you go to school, you go to university, you get a degree, you get a job. And my parents, sort of stayed in jobs for 40 odd years. That was what they did. They had a career for life. And so those that are growing, have been growing up in the 90s, 2000s, and now today, things have changed somewhat, where they're like, okay, I'm going to give a few things a bit of a go. Yet they've got, parents and grandparents sort of saying, well, what are you doing? Can't you just settle down? Can't you find something that you're good at? What's wrong with you? Just pick something and stick with it. And so therefore, there's a lot of, I'm going to say, myths and
Yes,
that have been placed upon them from some old school thinking.
it's in what we've all heard, that you can't live your life according to somebody else's
Mm,
expectations, right?
mm,
You talk, Tracy, about education, and education, a lot of, I don't know about Australia, but certainly in the UK and in the US, education, tertiary education, university education is expensive, and kids tend
mm-hmm.
to take loans to get them through this process, right? And so
Yeah.
they graduate, and then they have a loan to pay off. In before they graduate, they tend to do part-time jobs, and these part-time jobs are unrelated to their work, because they can't get
Mm-hmm.
jobs related to their work, to their study, right? So they tend to do little jobs. Like in Australia, a number of the people that were working part-time in housekeeping, etc., were students.
Mm-hmm.
They were free at night, or they were free at certain times of the day, and therefore they did this, right? So the it's so two things that are odd, right? One is, while you're studying, the working that you're doing is unrelated to your studying,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not building on what you're studying, right? So you are working these part-time jobs in order to study. And what I call this old paradigm was, you learn, you starve in the hope of earning. So it goes
Yeah.
learn, starve, and then earn,
Mm-hmm.
right? Today,
Mm.
you don't have to do that. I mean, I very often get work done, and I go into Fiverr or Freelancer, and I hire somebody. I don't ask them, do you have a university degree? I
No.
shoot them across some work, and I ask them, show me this, I'll pay for this, and if it's great, I'll pay for more, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so So learning has changed from learn, starve, earn to learn, do, earn. Learn,
Mm-hmm.
do, earn, learn, do. Maybe I don't need to go to university,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And why should I go to university to study something that somebody has packaged and put in a box and presented to me when I can just learn at my own pace and I can push the boundaries and be much deeper. So
Mm.
I honestly think in 20 years time, universities, except for some specialized degrees, maybe, medicine or dentistry or stuff like that, I think universities are in for disruption. Because
Mm.
honestly, do you want to go through this learn, starve, earn? Why do you want to do
Mm-hmm.
that? Why don't
Mm-hmm.
you want to go learn, do, earn?
Yeah.
And if learn, do, earn becomes available, yeah, maybe I'll do a 2 week course at University of Sydney. Maybe I'll do a 1 week course at RMIT. I'll do a 2 weeks in Harvard. Who's going to ask me for my degree? They're going to
Mm.
ask me, can you do this job? Can you show me how you do this job? And that's going to disrupt human resources. It's going to disrupt recruitment, because recruitment is no longer going to be able to say, hey, Tracy, did you get this degree? Yes, you got this degree. Did you
Mm-hmm.
work for 2 years? Who cares what you did? You worked for 2 years, you got this degree, you got the job.
Mm.
So HR people don't have that skill set to work through Tracy and understand whether Tracy can do the job.
Yeah.
But entrepreneurial companies, they don't ask you for your degree. Join the team. Let's figure out what you can do. Let's figure out where
Mm-hmm.
your skills are, and let's figure out the role that you have. And so you've got large companies competing for these people, and you've got entrepreneurial companies also competing. Where do you think these guys are going to go?
Mm-hmm.
Every young person who's in a large company is asking himself the question, or herself this question: does this make sense?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's an exciting, I mean, that's a really exciting time for, young ones to be growing. And I mean, you're never too old. I mean, you and I are in that world right now. We're constantly learning, I mean, I can just say for myself, just before we jumped on this, I'm like, okay, I want to know more about TikTok. So what do I do? Do I need to go and go to university to learn about that? No, I can
Exactly.
find somebody who is very skilled at the art of how does this platform TikTok work, and I can learn from them, and I then apply my learnings to my own situation, rather than it being I've learned something, it's come to me in a cookie box and I have to apply it in that such manner.
Exactly.
In this day and age, we just don't have to do that. So I think it's an extremely, exciting time. And I think the other thing that is interesting about what you talk about is that there is this element of realism, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier. You talked about when you're planning, you're creating goals, you want to be realistic about
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
so you're not falling over your own feet or beating yourself up because I didn't meet some big hairy audacious goal that actually was not realistic at the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
So that being also one of the other nine
That's right.
entrepreneurisms. And then I think there's another one that you talk about, which is execution. So
Right.
let's talk about how
That's
the
everything.
importance of that. That's right. So let's talk about that, because intention, a skill set, a desire, that's all lovely.
Correct.
But if you don't actually execute, you're going to be, you have no result or a very mediocre result.
There's a very old English saying which says there's many a slip between the cup
Mm,
and the lip. And
mm,
this is the intention gap, right? So
yeah.
it's what we call the intention action gap, right? So the intention action gap is where you really want to do something, but you don't follow up with any action, and therefore it doesn't get done. And you kid yourself by saying, I can do it anytime I want, but you haven't done it, right? And so
Mm,
people are saying, oh, well, I need to know I can do it well before I do it, or it needs to be perfect. And this is a mistake, right? The new perfect is done. It's better to
yeah.
be done than to be perfect.
Hmm.
Because perfect for who, right?
Mm,
You can never go down that path and say it's perfect for who, right? So get things done, get an iteration, and look at Apple, right? Look at they release a product that's half baked,
Mm.
and then people pile in, and other companies like Microsoft and Ericsson laugh at you, and then people are piling in with their comments, and you're building that emotional connection with your audience, with your customers. You're building that you're exposing this vulnerability, and then you get the product right. And all the while, these companies were sitting on the
Mhm.
sidelines laughing at you, and
Mhm.
suddenly, where are you gone? I mean, I think
Yeah.
there must have been a cultural change, for example, when Microsoft, which was, a package company, right? So it had to be perfect, because in the old days, it was sold to you on a CD-ROM, right? So
Mm.
if there was a mistake in the program, they couldn't ship it out, right?
Yeah.
So the mindset was, it has to, and that was NASA as well, right? And why did
Mhm.
Elon Musk get it? Because there were mistakes, and it cost them tremendously, and so they said, we're never going to do anything unless the percentage of possibility of error is less than 0.0000 whatever, right? And
Mm.
so the mindset is, let's get it perfect before we get it out. And then
Mm.
you get companies like Google, and you get companies like uh, um, you know um, the software companies who
Mhm.
say, hey, it's okay if you find something that's wrong, tell us, we'll fix
Mhm.
it.
And I
And
think that the interesting thing about that too is this time has changed. When we think back to the Microsoft days where you got a CD-ROM, and there was a level of, we've got to get it right, because as from a risk point of view, there's no opportunity for us to be able to fix it on the fly. But as
correct.
things have changed, and as the software market in particular means that you've got people in the back end, it's live, it's able to make changes as they see fit on any given day. We're constantly seeing on my computer regularly, it comes up with, there's an upgrade, there's a, and so they're able to do that now with the level of progression that we're seeing in that particular market. And I think, again, we can look to some of these markets for opportunities that we can
Mhm.
apply and innovate into different markets. So I think there's, in my opinion, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do that. The pandemic, as we've brought up a couple of times, has created a huge amount of disruption, but also a lot of opportunity has come with that, because it really has shifted the way people think. And often when we get that shift in thinking and maybe opening of some different ways of thinking about things, it creates opportunities for people. And it's going to be those that actually take who take their passion, use that innovation, look at the opportunities, take the learnings that they have, apply some form of realism to it, and then actually go ahead and execute, that are going to be very successful in the next years to come.
Yep. And Tracy, thank you for such a marvelous summary. I'm going to have to get you, when I have a TV show, I'm going to get you on the TV show to explain to
To
explain it.
explain that.
Explain.
Well, there you go. It's just using all of your 9 entrepreneurisms, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
true that all the things that you talk about in your book, and that those 9 entrepreneurisms are very relevant in not just today's market, but they've always been relevant.
Correct.
And if you look at those businesses, or those entrepreneurs or business people that have been very successful in the past, you're most likely to find that they have applied all of these 9
Yep.
things.
And you have to do different things at different times, right? So
Mm,
you have to be realistic about what your resources are. You have to be realistic about your capability, and sometimes you have to be opportunistic, and other times, you have to understand where you are, right?
mm.
It's the Zen thing, right? Where am I?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to tell you a little story, because it's quite interesting about this. And just before Christmas, my family goes camping a lot. So those that
Okay.
listen to the Unlock show would know that we go camping. And anyhow, as we have tents, and the kids usually come with us a lot. And anyhow, just before Christmas, we were not too far from home, just down the road at a campground, and a massive storm came through. and it was just my husband and I there, and the wind just picked up and almost blew the tent away. We would have been Dorothy and Toto blimmin', almost going down the road. We were trying to hang on to this thing with all of our might, which luckily for us, we were able to do. But what it did was that as the storm was happening, I'm thinking to myself, we are not going to have a good night's sleep tonight. This is one of those moments where we just have to say, camping in this tonight is just not going to work. So let's take this tent down. So take everything down. So we're in the middle of almost hurricane winds, trying to take everything down. And we pack it all back into the car. And on our way home, where I was thinking to myself, well, I've really got to think about, I love camping. I've really got to think about how to do this a bit differently, because that experience just there was not fun. And I don't want to have to do that again. So I jump online and I'm looking for a camper. And it just so happened that a couple of nights before, as we're walking around the campground, as you do, we see this little teardrop camper. And we were having, like you were saying, there's a whole lot of companies that are sitting on the sideline having a bit of a giggle at Apple, thinking, oh, what are they up to? We actually did the same thing when we saw this little wee teardrop camper, tiny little thing. Basically, you can get in it and it's not much bigger than a dog box, right? So my husband and I, he said, look at that, that's pretty cool. Kitchen in the back. But I sort of went, what? Well, that's tiny. Who's going to sleep in that? Anyhow, on our way home, I'm looking up online and I'm like, because we need to rethink this situation, first thing I did is go and have a look, see if I can find a teardrop camper. Wonder what these things are all about. Funnily enough, at that moment, I found one. And I was like, hey, here's a cool little camper. Let's go and have a look at that. So anyway, off we go the next day, go and have a look at this little camper. And it was on for, I don't know, $3,500. And I said to the guy, look, not knowing much about teardrop campers at all, just thought we could buy it because it was in pretty rough condition. I could buy it. It looks like it's something I could kind of work on myself. I could do that up. So I lowballed him, said, well, will you take $2,000? And he said, yeah, all right, I'll take it. So anyway, we take this little camper home, and before Christmas, I'm in there sanding it, working on it, doing, refurbishing the whole thing, and it's come up really beautifully. But what I learned through that process is sometimes when you look at things like, right, so me slagging off this little teardrop camper, who's going to want one of those? Then I go and get it. I spend a bit of time and effort and work on it. And I just flipped it yesterday for $7,500, and I spent $800 on the thing to get it up to scratch. So often,
I hope your buyer is not listening to the program.
I know, I hope not. Sorry, people, but we put a lot of work and effort into doing it. So I hope they will love it, and it's a beautiful little thing. But with that passion, a bit of innovation, the opportunism that existed there.
That's right.
And then the learning that we had over time around, all right, well, when we go camping, these are the things that we enjoy having in our camping setup, apply them into that, apply them into the camper. And then the execution of actually getting that job done so it looks good and it appeals to a market, that gives you a return on an investment.
It does indeed. And we have kids, we all have this experience, we have employees. We realize that execution is critical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the companies that can execute, and there are wonderful examples. Microsoft is an example of a company that just executes brilliantly. They may not get the first idea, they may not get the second idea, but when they put their mind to it, they are forced to be reckoned with.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And something I would say about this, if people are thinking about, what can I do? I'm looking to do something a little bit different. Sometimes you don't always have to go and create something brand new. And that story that I just told about a teardrop camper that has been around, those teardrop campers have been around forever. They're not, you don't see them everywhere. However, something old can often also be an opportunity for you to bring forward into today's market, and maybe just using the aesthetics of what people are looking for today to make it desirable.
And look at Airbnb, right? So Airbnb is creating hotel rooms in other people's homes.
Yeah.
But that's how the industry was 200 years ago or
Mm.
100 years ago, right? That's how it used
Mm-hmm.
to be. So it's Peter Thiel wrote an interesting book. I think it's called Zero to One, and he talks about this innovation, right? So you can innovate
Mm.
by making another better product, or you can innovate by being completely different, right? So in the
Yeah.
case of and he said the best ones are obviously the ones that is an old idea that most people have forgotten,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
it's sound, right?
Yeah.
And so the same with electric cars. I mean, in the 1930s in New York, I think electric cars outnumbered petrol cars. I mean, electric cars were the first cars, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were mainly driven by women because and they wanted to drive short range. So in New York, I think in the 1930s, electric cars were the only cars you could get. But then,
Mm.
you know, petrol cars came in, and then when the automatic starter came in, so you didn't have to crank the car,
Yeah.
and then petrol stations came in, and then the electric car just couldn't compete, right? And it's taken, well, exactly 100 years, not 100, a little short of 100 years, and now today I'm pretty sure electric cars will outsell petrol cars.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They always made sense. It's
It's
just they couldn't do a couple of things that people wanted, which
yeah.
is to go long distance.
And maybe that's, if anything people get out of today's episode is you don't necessarily have to look to create something new. Go and even have a look at some of the things that have been done 100 years ago, and can you innovate that and bring it back and apply it in today's market? And you might
Right.
find that there are a lot of things there that actually could be, what was old now is new. What was out of fashion always comes back in. You just have to look at the clothing market to realize that that's what happens. I'm going to say it's a recycle economy, right? You're seeing that happen on the regular. So I want to let everybody know,
Don't
Anwar.
forget about
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry. Don't forget about sourdough bread, right? It used to be the
Oh,
only bread, and now it's come. Look at the way it's come back. It was
it's
forgotten, and it's
yeah,
come back.
it's like the thing, right? You go and get some sourdough bread. Yeah, it's the thing to do. It's the thing of the moment. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows where to go and get more of you. So if they want to learn more about the 9 entrepreneurisms, or they want to, I know you help a lot of people, organizations, entrepreneurs really improve their businesses and their lives. Where can they go to get more of you? Where's the best place for them to connect with you?
My website, anwarjumabhoy.com, or contact me on LinkedIn. And if you want to book a sharing session, happy to do that. Just say I heard you with Tracy, and we can do a half hour together.
Fantastic. Well, there you go, guys. If you want to have continue this conversation with Anwar, make sure that you head on over to his website or connect with him on LinkedIn, and he'd be, as he said, he's happy to have a bit more of a chat with you. I love the fact that you call it a sharing session. I love that, and I want to say thank you very much for being here today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, and having a really good chat about what's going on in the world of entrepreneurism today, because I think there's a lot of fantastic opportunity for people. So thank you for being a great guest.
Thank you, Tracy. It's been a wonderful spending this time with you.
You're very welcome. All right, guys. Well, thanks very much for joining us today. I'll be back again with another episode of The Unlock Show on Wednesday, 10 a.m. Brisbane time. So until then, live your life unlocked, because as you know, there's just no other way. Bye for now.